Chapter 14: The Mediumship of Arthur Colman. Arthur Colman was so intimate a friend of Mr. Eglinton's, and so much associated with him in my thoughts in the days when I first knew them both, that it seems only natural that I should write of him next. His powers were more confined to materialization than Eglinton's, but in that he excelled. He is the most wonderful materializing medium I ever met in England, but of late years, owing to the injury it did him in his profession, he has been compelled, in justice to himself, to give up sitting for physical manifestations, and, indeed, sitting at all, except to oblige his friends. I cannot but consider this decision on his part as a great public loss, but until the public takes more interest in the next world than they do in this, it will not make it worth the while of such as Mr. Colman to devote their lives, health, and strength to their enlightenment. For to be a good physical medium means literally to part, little by little, with one's own life, and no man can be expected to do so much for the love of a set of unbelievers and skeptics, who will use up all his powers, and then go home to call him a rogue and a cheat and a trickster. If, as I am persuaded, each one of us is surrounded by the influences we gather of our own free will about us, the loving and noble-hearted by angels, the selfish and unbelieving by devils, and we consider how the latter preponderate over the former in this world, is it to be wondered at that most séances are conducted by an assemblage of evil spirits brought there by the sitters themselves? Skeptical, blasphemous, and sensual men and women collect together to try and find out the falsehood, not the truth, of spiritualism, and are tricked by the very influences that attend their footsteps and direct their daily lives, and therein lies the danger of spiritualism as a pursuit, taken up out of curiosity rather than a desire to learn. It gives increased power to the evil that surrounds ourselves, and the devil that goes out of us returns with 7 other devils worse than himself. The drunkard, who, by giving rein to a weakness which he knows he should resist, has attracted to him the spirits of drunkards gone before, joins a séance, and by the collaboration of forces, as it were, bestows increased power on the guides he has chosen for himself to lead him into greater evil. This dissertation, however, called forth by the never-ceasing wonder I feel at the indifference of the world towards such sights as I have seen, has led me further than I intended from the subject of my chapter. Arthur Colman is a young man of delicate constitution and appearance, who was at one time almost brought down to death's door by the demands made by physical phenomena upon his strength, but since he has given up sitting, he has regained his health, and looks quite a different person. This fact proves of itself what a tax is laid upon the unfortunate medium for such manifestations. Since he has resolved, however, never to sit again, I am all the more anxious to record what I have seen through him, probably for the last time. When I first knew my husband Colonel Lean, he had seen nothing of spiritualism, and was proportionately curious, and naturally a little skeptical on the subject, or, rather let me say, incredulous. He was hardly prepared to receive all the marvels I told him of without proof, and Mr. Colman's guide, Amy, was very anxious to convince him of their truth. She arranged, therefore, a séance at which he was to be present, and which was to be held at the house of Mr. and Mrs. George Neville. The party dined there together previously, and consisted only of Mr. and Mrs. Neville, Arthur Colman, Colonel Lean, and myself. As we were in the drawing-room, however, after dinner, and before we had commenced the séance, an American lady, who was but slightly known to any of us, was announced. We had particularly wished to have no strangers present, and her advent proportionately annoyed us, but we did not know on what excuse to get rid of her. She was a pushing sort of person, and when Mrs. Neville told her we were going to hold a séance, as a sort of hint that she might take her leave, it only made her resolve to stay. Indeed, she declared she had had a premonition of the fact. She said that whilst in her own room that morning, a figure had appeared standing by her bed, dressed in blue and white, like the pictures of the Virgin Mary, and that all day she had had an impression that she must spend the evening with the Nevilles, and she should hear something more about it. We could not get rid of the lady, so we were obliged to ask her to remain and assist at the séance, which she had already made up her mind to do, so we commenced our preparations. The 2 drawing-rooms communicated by folding doors, which were opened, and a portière drawn across the opening. In the back room we placed Mr. Colman's chair. He was dressed in a light grey suit, which we secured in the following manner. His hands were first sewn inside the sleeves of the coat, then his arms were placed behind his back, and the coat sleeves sewn together to the elbow. We then sewed his trouser legs together in the same way. We then tied him round the throat, waist, and legs with white cotton, which the least movement on his part would break, and the ends of each ligament were sealed to the wall of the room with wax and stamped with my seal with Florence Marryat on it. Considering him thus secure, without any possibility of escape unless we discovered it, we left him in the back room, and arranged ourselves on a row of 5 chairs before the portiere in the front one, which was lighted by a single gas burner. I sat at the head of the row, then the American lady, Mrs. Neville, Colonel Lean and Mr. Neville. I am not sure how long we waited for the manifestations, but I do not think it was many minutes before a female figure glided from the side of the curtain and took a vacant chair by my side. I said, "Who is this?" and she whispered,
"Florence,"
and laid her head down on my shoulder, and kissed my neck. I was turning towards her to distinguish her features more fully, when I became aware that a second figure was standing in front of me, and Florence said,
"Mother, there is Powell's."
And at the same time, as he bent down to speak to me, his beard touched my face. I had not had time to draw the attention of my friends to the spirits that stood by me, when I was startled by hearing one exclamation after another from the various sitters. The American lady called out,
"There's the woman that came to me this morning."
Mr. Neville said,
"That is my father."
and Colonel Lean was asking someone if he would not give his name. I looked down the line of sitters. Before Colonel Lean there stood an old man with a long, white beard. A somewhat similar figure was in front of Mr. Neville. Before the dark curtain appeared a woman dressed in blue and white, like a nun, and meanwhile, Florence and Powell still maintained their station by my side. As if this were not enough of itself to turn a mortal's brain, the portiere was at the same moment drawn aside, and there stood Arthur Colman in his grey suit, freed from all his bonds, but under the control of Amy, who called out joyously to my husband,
"Now, Frank, will you believe?"
She dropped the curtain, the apparitions glided or faded away, and we passed into the back drawing-room, to find Mr. Colman still in trance, just as we had left him, and with all the seals and stitches intact. Not a thread of them all was broken. This is the largest number of spirits I have ever seen at one time with one medium. I have seen 2 materialized spirits at a time, and even 3, from Mr. Williams and Miss Showers and Katie Cook, but on this occasion there were 5 apparent with the medium, all standing together before us. And this is the sort of thing that the majority of people do not consider it worth their while to take a little trouble to see. I have already related how successfully Florence used to materialize through this medium, and numerous friends, utterly unknown to him, have revisited us through his means. His trance mediumship is as wonderful as his physical phenomena, some people might think more so. Amongst others, 2 spirits have come back to us through Mr. Colman, neither of whom he knew in this life, and both of whom are, in their way, too characteristic to be mistaken. One is Phyllis Glover the actress, the other my stepson, Francis Lean, who was drowned by an accident at sea. Phyllis Glover was a woman who led a very eventful life, chiefly in America, and was a versatile genius in conversation, as in everything else. She was peculiar also, and had a half-Yankee way of talking, and a store of familiar sayings and anecdotes, which she constantly introduced into her conversation. She was by no means an ordinary person whilst in this life, and in order to imitate her manner and speech successfully, one would need to be as clever a person as herself. And, without wishing to derogate from the powers of Mr. Colman's mind, he knows, and I know, that Phyllis Glover was cleverer than either of us. When her influence or spirit therefore returns through him, it is quite unmistakable. It is not only that she retains all her little tricks of voice and feature and manner, which Mr. Colman has never seen, but she alludes to circumstances that took place in this life and people she was associated with here that he has never heard of. More, she will relate her old stories and anecdotes, and sing her old songs, and give the most incontrovertible tests of her identity, even to recalling facts and incidents that have entirely passed from our minds. When she appears through him, it is Phyllis Glover we are sitting with again and talking with, as familiarly as we did in the days gone by. Francis, in his way too, is quite as remarkable. The circumstances of his death and the events leading to it were unknown to us, till he related them through Mr. Colman, and he speaks to us of the contents of private letters, and repeats conversations and alludes to circumstances and names that are known only to him and ourselves. He had a peculiar manner also, quick and nervous, and a way of cutting his words short, which his spirit preserves to the smallest particular, and which furnished the strongest proofs possible of his identity to those who knew him here below. But these are but a very few amongst the innumerable tests furnished by Arthur Colman's occult powers of the assured possibility of communicating with the spirits of those gone before us. Chapter 15: The Mediumship of Mrs. Guppy Volckman. The mediumship of this lady is so well known, and has been so universally attested, that nothing I can write of could possibly add to her fame, and as I made her acquaintance but a short time before she relinquished sitting for manifestations, I have had but little experience of her powers, but such as I enjoyed were very remarkable. I have alluded to them in the story of the Green Lady, whose apparition was due solely to Mrs. Guppy Volckman's presence, and on that occasion she gave us another wonderful proof of her mediumship. A sheet was procured and held up at either end by Mr. Charles Williams and herself. It was held in the light, in the centre of the room, forming a white wall of about 5 feet high, i.e., as high as their arms could conveniently reach. Both the hands of Mrs. Volckman and Mr. Williams were placed outside the sheet, so that no trickery might be suspected through their being concealed. In a short time the head of a woman appeared above the sheet, followed by that of a man, and various pairs of hands, both large and small, which bobbed up and down, and seized the hands of the spectators, whilst the faces went close to the media, as if with the intention of kissing them. This frightened Mrs. Volckman, so that she frequently screamed and dropped her end of the sheet, which, had there been any deception, must inevitably have exposed it. It seemed to make no difference to the spirits, however, who reappeared directly they had the opportunity, and made her at last so nervous that she threw the sheet down and refused to hold it any more. The faces were life-size, and could move their eyes and lips, the hands were some as large as a man's, and covered with hair, and others like those of a woman or child. They had all the capability of working the fingers and grasping objects presented to them, whilst the 4 hands belonging to the media were kept in sight of the audience, and could not have worked machinery even if they could have concealed it. The first time I was introduced to Mrs. Volckman, then Mrs. Guppy, was at a séance at her own house in Victoria Road, where she had assembled a large party of guests, including several names well known in art and literature. We sat in a well-lighted drawing-room, and the party was so large that the circle round the table was 3 deep. Mrs. Mary Hardy, the American medium, since dead, was present, and the honours of the manifestations may be therefore, I conclude, divided between the 2 ladies. The table, a common deal one, made for such occasions, with a round hole of about 20 inches in diameter in the middle of it, was covered with a cloth that hung down, and was nailed to the ground, leaving only the aperture free. I must premise that this cloth had been nailed down by a committee of the gentlemen visitors, in order that there might be no suspicion of a confederate hidden underneath it. We then sat round the table, but without placing our hands on it. In a short time hands began to appear through the open space in the table, all sorts of hands, from the woman's taper fingers and the baby's dimpled fist, to the hands of old and young men, wrinkled or muscular. Some of the hands had rings on the fingers, by which the sitters recognized them, some stretched themselves out to be grasped, and some appeared in pairs, clasped together or separate. One hand took a glove from a sitter and put it on the other, showing the muscular force it possessed by the way in which it pressed down each finger and then buttoned the glove. Another pair of hands talked through the dumb alphabet to us, and a third played on a musical instrument. I was leaning forward, before I had witnessed the above, peering inquisitively down the hole, and saying, I wonder if they would have strength to take anything down with them, when a large hand suddenly appeared and very nearly took me down, by seizing my nose as if it never meant to let go again. At all events, it took me a peg or 2 down, for I remember it brought the tears into my eyes with the force it exhibited. After the hands had ceased to appear, the table was moved away, and we sat in a circle in the light. Mrs. Guppy did not wish to take a part in the séance, except as a spectator, so she retired to the back drawing-room with the Baroness Adelma Vey and other visitors, and left Mrs. Hardy with the circle in the front. Suddenly, however, she was levitated and carried in the sight of us all into the midst of our circle. As she felt herself rising in the air, she called out,
Don't let go hands for heaven's sake.
We were standing in a ring, and I had hold of the hand of Prince Albert of Soms. As Mrs. Guppy came sailing over our heads, her feet caught his neck and mine, and in our anxiety to do as she had told us, we gripped tight hold of each other, and were thrown forward on our knees by the force with which she was carried past us into the center. This was a pretty strong proof to us, whatever it may be to others, that our senses did not deceive us when we thought we saw Mrs. Guppy over our heads in the air. The influence that levitated her, moreover, placed her on a chair with such a bump that it broke the 2 front legs off. As soon as Mrs. Guppy had rejoined us, the order was given to put out the light and to wish for something. We unanimously asked for flowers, it being the middle of December, and a hard frost. Simultaneously we smelt the smell of fresh earth, and were told to light the gas again, when the following extraordinary sight met our view. In the middle of the sitters, still holding hands, was piled up on the carpet an immense quantity of mould, which had been torn up apparently with the roots that accompanied it. There were laurestinus, and laurels, and holly, and several others, just as they had been pulled out of the earth and thrown down in the midst of us. Mrs. Guppy looked anything but pleased at the state of her carpet, and begged the spirits would bring something cleaner next time. They then told us to extinguish the lights again, and each sitter was to wish mentally for something for himself. I wished for a yellow butterfly, knowing it was December, and as I thought of it, a little cardboard box was put into my hand. Prince Albert whispered to me.
"Have you got anything?"
"Yes," I said, "but not what I asked for. I expect they have given me a piece of jewelry." When the gas was relit, I opened the box, and there lay 2 yellow butterflies, dead, of course, but none the less extraordinary for that. I wore at that séance a tight-fitting, high white muslin dress, over a tight petticoat body. The dress had no pocket, and I carried my handkerchief, a fine cambric one, in my hand. When the séance was over, I found this handkerchief had disappeared, at which I was vexed, as it had been embroidered for me by my sister Emily, then dead. I inquired of every sitter if they had seen it, even making them turn out their pockets in case they had taken it in mistake for their own, but it was not to be found, and I returned home, as I thought, without it. What was my surprise on removing my dress and petticoat bodice to find the handkerchief, neatly folded into a square of about 4 inches, between my stays and the garment beneath them, placed, moreover, over the smallest part of my waist, where no fingers could have penetrated even had my dress been loose. My woman readers may be able better than the men to appreciate the difficulty of such a maneuver by mortal means. Indeed, it would have been quite impossible for myself or anybody else to place the handkerchief in such a position without removing the stays. And it was folded so neatly also, and placed so smoothly, that there was not a crumple in the cambric. Chapter 16: The Mediumship of Florence Cook. In writing of my own mediumship, or the mediumship of any other person, I wish it particularly to be understood that I do not intend my narrative to be, by any means, an account of all séances held under that control. For were I to include everything that I have seen and heard during my researches into spiritualism, this volume would swell to unconscionable dimensions, but only of certain events which I believe to be remarkable, and not enjoyed by every one in like measure. Most people have read of the ordinary phenomena that take place at such meetings. My readers, therefore, will find no description here of marvels which, whether true or false, can be accounted for upon natural grounds. Miss Florence Cook, now Mrs. L.G. Corner, is one of the media who have been most talked of and written about. Mr. Alfred Crooks took an immense interest in her, and published a long account of his investigation of spiritualism under her mediumship. Mr. Henry Dunphy, of the Morning Post, wrote a series of papers for London Society, of which magazine I was then the editor, describing her powers, and the proof she gave of them. The first time I ever met Florence Cook was in his private house, when my little daughter appeared through her, vide the story of my spirit child. On that occasion, as we were sitting at supper after the séance, a party of perhaps 30 people, the whole dinner table, with everything upon it, rose bodily in the air to a level with our knees, and the dishes and glasses swayed about in a perilous manner, without, however, coming to any permanent harm. I was so much astonished at, and interested by, what I saw that evening, that I became most anxious to make the personal acquaintance of Miss Cook. She was the medium for the celebrated spirit, Katy King, of whom so much has been believed and disbelieved, and the séances she gave at her parents' house in Hackney, for the purpose of seeing this figure alone, used to be crowded by the cleverest and most scientific men of the day, Sergeants Cox and Ballantyne, Mr. S. C. Hall, Mr. Alfred Crooks, and many others, being on terms of the greatest intimacy with her. Mr. William Harrison, of the Spiritualist paper, was the one to procure me an introduction to the family and an entrance to the séances, for which I shall always feel grateful to him. For the benefit of the uninitiated, let me begin by telling who Katie King was supposed to be. Her account of herself was that her name was Annie Owens Morgan, that she was the daughter of Sir Henry Morgan, a famous buccaneer who lived about the time of the Commonwealth, and suffered death upon the high seas, being, in fact, a pirate, that she herself was about 12 years old when Charles I was beheaded, that she married and had 2 little children, that she committed more crimes than we should like to hear of, having murdered men with her own hands, but yet died quite young, at about 2 or 3 and 20. To all questions concerning the reason of her reappearance on earth, she returned but one answer, that it was part of the work given her to do to convince the world of the truth of spiritualism. This was the information I received from her own lips. She had appeared to the cook some years before I saw her, and had become so much one of the family as to walk about the house at all times without alarming the inmates. She often materialized and got into bed with her medium at night, much to Florey's annoyance, and after Miss Cook's marriage to Captain Corner, he told me himself that he used to feel at first as if he had married 2 women, and was not quite sure which was his wife of the 2. The order of these séances was always the same. Miss Cook retired to a back room, divided from the audience by a thin damask curtain, and presently the form of Katie King would appear dressed in white, and walk out amongst the sitters in gaslight, and talk like one of themselves. Florence Cook, as I mentioned before, is a very small, slight brunette, with dark eyes and dark curly hair and a delicate aquiline nose. Sometimes Katie resembled her exactly, at others, she was totally different. Sometimes, too, she measured the same height as her medium, at others, she was much taller. I have a large photograph of Katie taken under limelight. In it she appears as the double of Florey Cook, yet Florey was looking on whilst the picture was taken. I have sat for her several times with Mr. Crooks, and seen the tests applied which are mentioned in his book on the subject. I have seen Florey's dark curls nailed down to the floor, outside the curtain, in view of the audience, whilst Katie walked about and talked with us. I have seen Florey placed on the scale of a weighing machine constructed by Mr. Crooks for the purpose, behind the curtain, whilst the balance remained in sight. I have seen under these circumstances that the medium weighed 8 stone in a normal condition, and that as soon as the materialized form was fully developed, the balance ran up to 4 stone. Moreover, I have seen both Florey and Katie together on several occasions, so I can have no doubt on the subject that they were 2 separate creatures. Still, I can quite understand how difficult it must have been for strangers to compare the strong likeness that existed between the medium and the spirit, without suspecting they were one and the same person. One evening Katie walked out and perched herself upon my knee. I could feel she was a much plumper and heavier woman than Miss Cook, but she wonderfully resembled her in features, and I told her so. Katie did not seem to consider it a compliment. She shrugged her shoulders, made a grimace, and said,
I know I am. I can't help it, but I was much prettier than that in earth life. You shall see, some day, you shall see.
After she had finally retired that evening, she put her head out at the curtain again and said, with the strong lisp she always had,
I want Mrs. Ross Church.
I rose and went to her, when she pulled me inside the curtain, when I found it was so thin that the gas shining through it from the outer room made everything in the inner quite visible. Katie pulled my dress impatiently and said,
Sit down on the ground.
Which I did. She then seated herself in my lap, saying,
And now, dear, we'll have a good confab, like women do on earth.
Florence Cook, meanwhile, was lying on a mattress on the ground close to us, wrapped in a deep trance. Katie seemed very anxious I should ascertain beyond doubt that it was Florey.
Touch her.
She said,
Take her hand, pull her curls. Do you see that it is Florey lying there?
When I assured her I was quite satisfied there was no doubt of it, the spirit said,
Then look round this way, and see what I was like in earth life.
I turned to the form in my arms, and what was my amazement to see a woman fair as the day, with large grey or blue eyes, a white skin, and a profusion of golden red hair. Katie enjoyed my surprise, and asked me.
Ain't I prettier than Florrie now?
She then rose and procured a pair of scissors from the table, and cut off a lock of her own hair and a lock of the medium's, and gave them to me. I have them safe to this day. One is almost black, soft and silky, the other a coarse golden red. After she had made me this present, Katie said,
Go back now, but don't tell the others tonight, or they'll all want to see me.
On another very warm evening she sat on my lap amongst the audience, and I felt perspiration on her arm. This surprised me, and I asked her if, for the time being, she had the veins, nerves, and secretions of a human being, if blood ran through her body, and she had a heart and lungs. Her answer was,
I have everything that Florrie has.
On that occasion also she called me after her into the back room, and, dropping her white garment, stood perfectly naked before me.
Now,
She said,
you can see that I am a woman.
which indeed she was, and a most beautifully made woman too, and I examined her well, whilst Miss Cook lay beside us on the floor. Instead of dismissing me this time, Katie told me to sit down by the medium, and, having brought me a candle and matches, said I was to strike a light as soon as she gave 3 knocks, as Florrie would be hysterical on awaking, and need my assistance. She then knelt down and kissed me, and I saw she was still naked. Where is your dress, Katie? I asked.
Oh, that's gone.
She said,
I've sent it on before me.
As she spoke thus, kneeling beside me, she rapped 3 times on the floor. I struck the match almost simultaneously with the signal, but as it flared up, Katie King was gone like a flash of lightning, and Miss Cook, as she had predicted, awoke with a burst of frightened tears, and had to be soothed into tranquility again. On another occasion Katie King was asked at the beginning of the séance, by one of the company, to say why she could not appear in the light of more than one gas burner. The question seemed to irritate her, and she replied,
I have told you all, several times before, that I can't stay under a searching light. I don't know why, but I can't, and if you want to prove the truth of what I say, turn up all the gas and see what will happen to me. Only remember, if you do there will be no séance tonight, because I shan't be able to come back again, and you must take your choice.
Upon this assertion it was put to the vote if the trial should be made or not, and all present, Mr. S.C. Hall was one of the party, decided we would prefer to witness the effect of a full glare of gas upon the materialized form than to have the usual sitting, as it would settle the vexed question of the necessity of gloom, if not darkness, for a materializing séance forever. We accordingly told Katie of our choice, and she consented to stand the test, though she said afterwards we had put her to much pain. She took up her station against the drawing-room wall, with her arms extended as if she were crucified. Then 3 gas burners were turned on to their full extent in a room about 16 feet square. The effect upon Katie King was marvelous. She looked like herself for the space of a second only, then she began gradually to melt away. I can compare the dematerialization of her form to nothing but a wax doll melting before a hot fire. First, the features became blurred and indistinct, they seemed to run into each other. The eyes sunk in the sockets, the nose disappeared, the frontal bone fell in. Next the limbs appeared to give way under her, and she sank lower and lower on the carpet like a crumbling edifice. At last there was nothing but her head left above the ground, then a heap of white drapery only, which disappeared with a whisk, as if a hand had pulled it after her, and we were left staring by the light of 3 gas burners at the spot on which Katie King had stood. She was always attired in white drapery, but it varied in quality. Sometimes it looked like longcloth, at others like mull muslin or jaconet, oftenest it was a species of thick cotton net. The sitters were much given to asking Katie for a piece of her dress to keep as a souvenir of their visit, and when they received it, would seal it up carefully in an envelope and convey it home, and were much surprised on examining their treasure to find it had totally disappeared. Katie used to say that nothing material about her could be made to last without taking away some of the medium's vitality, and weakening her in consequence. One evening, when she was cutting off pieces of her dress rather lavishly, I remarked that it would require a great deal of mending. She answered,
I'll show you how we mend dresses in the spirit world.
She then doubled up the front breadth of her garment 12 times, and cut 2 or 3 round holes in it. I am sure when she let it fall again there must have been 30 or 40 holes, and Katie said,
Isn't that a nice calendar?
She then commenced, whilst we stood close to her, to shake her skirt gently about, and in a minute it was as perfect as before, without a hole to be seen. When we expressed our astonishment, she told me to take the scissors and cut off her hair. She had a profusion of ringlets falling to her waist that night. I obeyed religiously, hacking the hair wherever I could, whilst she kept on saying,
Cut more. Cut more. Not for yourself, you know, because you can't take it away.
So I cut off curl after curl, and as fast as they fell to the ground, the hair grew again upon her head. When I had finished, Katie asked me to examine her hair, to see if I could detect any place where I had used the scissors, and I did so without any effect. Neither was the severed hair to be found. It had vanished out of sight. Katie was photographed many times, by limelight, by Mr. Alfred Crooks, but her portraits are all too much like her medium to be of any value in establishing her claim to a separate identity. She had always stated she should not appear on this earth after the month of May, 1874, and accordingly, on the 21st, she assembled her friends to say goodbye to them, and I was one of the number. Katie had asked Miss Cook to provide her with a large basket of flowers and ribbons, and she sat on the floor and made up a bouquet for each of her friends to keep in remembrance of her. Mine, which consists of lilies of the valley and pink geranium, looks almost as fresh today, nearly 17 years after, as it did when she gave it to me. It was accompanied by the following words, which Katie wrote on a sheet of paper in my presence.
From Annie Owen D. Morgan alias Katie to her friend Florence Marryat Ross Church. With love. Pensez-moi, May 21, 1874.
The farewell scene was as pathetic as if we had been parting with a dear companion by death. Katie herself did not seem to know how to go. She returned again and again to have a last look, especially at Mr. Alfred Crooks, who was as attached to her as she was to him. Her prediction has been fulfilled, and from that day, Florence Cook never saw her again nor heard anything about her. Her place was shortly filled by another influence, who called herself Marie, and who danced and sung in a truly professional style, and certainly as Miss Cook never either danced or sung. I should not have mentioned the appearance of this spirit, whom I only saw once or twice, excepting for the following reason. On one occasion Miss Cook, then Mrs. Corner, was giving a public séance at the rooms of the National British Association of Spiritualists, at which a certain Sir George Sitwell, a very young man, was present, and at which he declared that the medium cheated, and that the spirit Marie was herself, dressed up to deceive the audience. Letters appeared in the newspapers about it, and the whole press came down upon spiritualists, and declared them all to be either knaves or fools. These notices were published on the morning of a day on which Miss Cook was engaged to give another public séance, at which I was present. She was naturally very much cut up about them. Her reputation was at stake, her honor had been called into question, and being a proud girl, she resented it bitterly. Her present audience was chiefly composed of friends, but, before commencing, she put it to us whether, whilst under such a stigma, she had better not sit at all. We, who had all tested her and believed in her, were unanimous in repudiating the vile charges brought against her, and in begging the séance should proceed. Florrie refused, however, to sit unless someone remained in the cabinet with her, and she chose me for the purpose. I was therefore tied to her securely with a stout rope, and we remained thus fastened together for the whole of the evening. Under which conditions Marie appeared, and sung and danced outside the cabinet, just as she had done to Sir George Sitwell whilst her medium remained tied to me. So much for men who decide a matter before they have sifted it to the bottom. Mrs. L.G. Corner has long since given up mediumship either private or public, and lives deep down in the heart of Wales, where the babble and scandal of the city affect her no longer. But she told me, only last year, that she would not pass through the suffering she had endured on account of spiritualism again for all the good this world could give her. Chapter 17, The Mediumship of Katie Cook. In the matter of producing physical phenomena, the Cooks are a most remarkable family, all three daughters being powerful media, and that without any solicitation on their part. The second one, Katie, is by no means the least powerful of the three, although she has sat more privately than her sister Florence, and not had the same scientific tests, I believe, applied to her. The first time I had an opportunity of testing Katie's mediumship was at the private rooms of Signor Rondi, in a circle of 9 or 10 friends. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, being an artist's studio. The gas was kept burning, and before the sitting commenced the door was locked and strips of paper pasted over the opening inside. The cabinet was formed of a window curtain nailed across one corner of the room, behind which a chair was placed for the medium, who is a remarkably small and slight girl, much slighter than her sister Florence, with a thin face and delicate features. She was dressed, on this occasion, in a tight-fitting black gown and Hessian boots that buttoned halfway to her knee, and which, she informed me, she always wore when sitting, just as Miss Showers did, because they had each 18 buttons, which took a long time to fasten and unfasten. The party sat in a semicircle, close outside the curtain, and the light was lowered, but not extinguished. There was no darkness, and no holding of hands. I mention these facts to show how very simple the preparations were. In a few minutes the curtain was lifted, and a form, clothed in white, who called herself Lily, was presented to our view. She answered several questions relative to herself and the medium, and perceiving some doubt on the part of some of the sitters, she seated herself on my knee, I being nearest the curtain, and asked me to feel her body, and tell the others how differently she was made from the medium. I had already realized that she was much heavier than Katie Cook, as she felt like a heavy girl of 9 or 10 stone. I then passed my hand up and down her figure. She had full breasts and plump arms and legs, and could not have been mistaken by the most casual observers for Miss Cook. Whilst she sat on my knee, however, she desired my husband and Signor Rondi to go inside the curtain and feel that the medium was seated in her chair. When they did so, they found Katie was only half entranced. She thrust her feet out to view, and said,
I am not Lily. Feel my boots.
My husband had, at the same moment, one hand on Miss Cook's knee, and the other stretched out to feel the figure seated on my lap. There remained no doubt in his mind of there being 2 bodies there at the same time. Presently Lily passed her hand over my dress, and remarked how nice and warm it was, and how she wished she had one on too. I asked her, Are you cold? And she said,
Wouldn't you be cold if you had nothing but this white thing on?
Half jestingly, I took my fur cloak, which was on a sofa close by, and put it round her shoulders, and told her to wear it. Lily seemed delighted. She exclaimed,
Oh, how warm it is. May I take it away with me?
I said, Yes, if you will bring it back before I go home. I have nothing else to wear, remember. She promised she would, and left my side. In another moment she called out,
Turn up the gas.
We did so. Lily was gone, and so was my large fur cloak. We searched the little room round for it. It had entirely disappeared. There was a locked cupboard in which Signor Rondi kept drawing materials. I insisted on its being opened, although he declared it had not been unlocked for weeks, and we found it full of dust and drawing blocks, but nothing else, so the light was again lowered, and the séance resumed. In a short time the heavy cloak was flung, apparently from the ceiling, evidently from somewhere higher than my head, and fell right over it. I laid it again on the sofa, and thought no more about it until I returned home. I then found, to my astonishment, and considerably to my annoyance, that the fur of my cloak, which was a new one, was all coming out. My dress was covered with it, and from that day I was never able to wear the cloak again. Lily said she had dematerialized it, to take it away. Of the truth of that assertion I had no proof, but I am quite sure that she did not put it together again when she brought it back. An army of moths encamped in it could not have damaged it more, and I can vouch that until that evening the fur had been as perfect as when I purchased it. I think my next sitting with Katie Cook was at a séance held in Museum Street, and on the invitation of Mr. Chas Blackburn, who is one of the most earnest friends of spiritualism, and has expended a large amount of money in its research. The only other guests were my husband, and General and Mrs. McLean. We sat round a small uncovered table with the gas burning and without a cabinet. Miss Katie Cook had a seat between General McLean and myself, and we made sure of her proximity to us during the whole séance. In fact, I never let go of her hand, and even when she wished to use her pocket handkerchief, she had to do it with my hand clinging to her own. Neither did she go into a trance. We spoke to her occasionally during the sitting, and she answered us, though in a very subdued voice, as she complained of being sick and faint. In about 20 minutes, during which the usual manifestations occurred, the materialized form of Lily appeared in the middle of the table, and spoke to us and kissed us all in turn. Her face was very small, and she was only formed to the waist, but her flesh was quite firm and warm. Whilst Lily occupied the table in the full sight of all the sitters, and I had my hand upon Miss Cook's figure, for I kept passing my hand up and down from her face to her knees, to make sure it was not only a hand I held, someone grasped my chair from behind and shook it, and when I turned my head and spoke. In a moment one arm was round my neck and one round the neck of my husband, who sat next to me, whilst the voice of my daughter Florence spoke to us both, and her long hair and her soft white dress swept over our faces and hands. Her hair was so abundant and long, that she shook it out over my lap, that I might feel its length and texture. I asked Florence for a piece of her hair and dress, and scissors not being forthcoming, Lily materialized more fully, and walked round from the other side of the table and cut off a piece of Florence's dress herself with my husband's penknife, but said they could not give me the hair that time. The two spirits remained with us for, perhaps, half an hour or more, whilst General McLean and I continued to hold Miss Cook a prisoner. The power then failing, they disappeared, but every one present was ready to take his oath that two presences had been with us that never entered at the door. The room was small and unfurnished, the gas was burning, the medium sat for the whole time in our sight. Mrs. McLean and I were the only other women present, yet two girls bent over and kissed us, spoke to us, and placed their bare arms on our necks at one and the same time. There was again also a marked difference between the medium and the materializations. I have already described her appearance. Both of these spirits had plump faces and figures, my daughter Florence's hands especially being large and firm, and her loose hair nearly down to her knees. I had the pleasure of holding another séance with Katie Cook in the same rooms, when a new manifestation occurred. She is, as I have said, a very small woman, with very short arms. I am, on the contrary, a very large woman, with very long arms, yet the arm of the hand I held was elongated to such an extent that it reached the sitters on the other side of the table, where it would have been impossible for mine to follow it. I should think the limb must have been stretched to thrice its natural length, and that in the sight of everybody. I sat again with Katie Cook in her own house, where, if trickery is employed, she had every opportunity of tricking us, but the manifestations were much the same, and certainly not more marvelous than those she had exhibited in the houses of strangers. Lily and Florence both appeared at the same time, under circumstances that admitted of no possibility of fraud. My husband and I were accompanied on that occasion by our friends, Captain and Mrs. Kendall, and the order of sitting round the table was as follows: myself, Katie, Captain K, Florence Cook, my husband, Mrs. Cook, Mrs. Kendall. Each member of the family, it will be observed, was held between two detectives, and their hands were not once set free. I must say also that the séance was a free one, courteously accorded us on the invitation of Mrs. Cook, and if deception had been intended, we and our friends might just as well have been left to sit with Katie alone, whilst the other members of the family superintended the manifestation of the ghosts outside. Miss Florence Cook, indeed, Mrs. Corner, objected at first to sitting with us, on the score that her mediumship usually neutralized that of her sister, but her mother insisted on her joining the circle, lest any suspicion should be excited by her absence. The Cooks, indeed, are, all of them, rather averse to sitting than not, and cordially agree in disliking the powers that have been thrust upon them against their own will. These influences take possession of them, unfitting them for more practical work, and they must live. This is, I believe, the sole reason that they have never tried to make money by the exercise of their mediumship. But I, for one, fully believe them when they tell me that they consider the fact of their being media as the greatest misfortune that has ever happened to them. On the occasion of this last séance, cherries and rosebuds were showered in profusion on the table during the evening. These may easily be believed to have been secreted in the room before the commencement of the sitting, and produced at the proper opportunity, although the hands of everybody interested in their production were fast held by strangers. But it is less easy to believe that a lady of limited income, like Mrs. Cook, should go to such an expense for an unpaid séance, for the purpose of making converts of people who were strangers to her. Mediumship pays very badly as it is. I am afraid it would pay still worse if the poor media had to purchase the means for producing the phenomena, especially when, in a town like London, they run, as in this instance, to hothouse fruit and flowers. One more example of Katie Cook's powers and I have done. We were assembled one evening by the invitation of Mr. Charles Blackburn at his house, Elgin Crescent. We sat in a small breakfast room on the basement floor, so small, indeed, for the size of the party, that as we encircled a large round table, the sitters' backs touched the wall on either side, thus entirely preventing any one crossing the room whilst we were established there. The only piece of furniture of any consequence in the room, beside the chairs and table, was a trichord cabinet piano, belonging to Mrs. Cook, who was keeping house at the time for Mr. Blackburn, and which she much valued. Katie Cook sat amongst us as usual. In the middle of the séance her control Lily, who was materialized, called out,
Keep hands fast, don't let go, whatever you do.
and at the same time, without seeing anything, for we were sitting in complete darkness, we became conscious that something large and heavy was passing or being carried over our heads. One of the ladies of the party became nervous, and dropped her neighbour's hand with a cry of alarm, and, at the same moment, a weighty body fell with a fearful crash on the other side of the room. Lily exclaimed,
Someone has let go hands.
and Mrs. Cook called out.
Oh. It's my piano.
Lights were struck, when we found the cabinet piano had actually been carried from its original position right over our heads to the opposite side of the room, where it had fallen on the floor and been seriously damaged. The two carved legs were broken off, and the sounding board smashed in. Anyone who had heard poor Mrs. Cook's lamentations over the ruin of her favourite instrument, and the expense it would entail to get it restored, would have felt little doubt as to whether she had been a willing victim to this unwelcome proof of her daughter's physical mediumship.